This is The Toss-Up, where we take a look at some of the topics facing the world of college sports and give a little bit of the history behind some of them. We're not trying to change your mind, we just want to dive deeper into the topics that keep you tuned in to the teams you love. March. It's a month that everyone simply describes as madness. But does everything about it have to be mad? 2 weeks ago, the NCAA Selection Committee met to decide the 68 best teams for the NCAA tournament. Every year there are gripes. People complain about who made the tournament and what seed every team is. But this year seemed a little different. Wichita State went 30-4 this season. They were ranked 10th in KenPom and 32nd in RPI, and yet they were a 10 seed. And then there's Illinois State, which lost just 2 conference games, both of which to Wichita State, and they were ranked 33rd in RPI, and they didn't even make the field. Throw in Wisconsin being an 8 seed and Minnesota being a 5 seed, and once again we find ourselves saying, hey, it's March Madness. But why? Currently, the selection committee is comprised of a group of 10 individuals. And who are these individuals? They are athletic directors from various institutions. This year, the committee body was comprised of athletic directors from the University of Kentucky, Stanford, Creighton, and even Duke. In addition to all of this, the head of the committee is the athletic director for Michigan State, a team that some could argue shouldn't have even been in the tournament. Yet, they were a 9 seed. Michigan State was 2-8 on the road, and their best win of the season was against Minnesota. Maybe it's time to call into question the decision makers here. Why are athletic directors deciding who makes the tournament? Can there be a better way to do this? Maybe computer statistics could be used, just like in college football. Or maybe we need a new selection committee. Either way, it's worth the conversation. Now, let me introduce you to our panel. Alongside me, I've got Lydia Knoll, Michael Tilka, and Austin Magicardi. And first of all, do you think we're in a good place in regards to the current selection process, and what do you think needs to change? Lydia, what are your thoughts?
I think, like what you hinted to in your intro, I think right now we have personal ties on the selection committee, and I think some of those personal ties are interfering with the overall unbiased decision that needs to be made when selecting these teams that go into the tournament.
Now, Michael, what are your thoughts on the matter?
I think that there definitely needs to be a change on the NCAA Basketball Selection Committee. I would like to see something a little bit different, such as what they do for college football or something like that.
What about you, Austin?
Well, I think the biggest problem that we have is that these people are on the payroll of universities that are being considered for these tournament games, and that's always going to create a conflict of interest, even if they say, oh, well, you know, they have to step out of the room or whatever. It's always going to cause a problem, even if we don't acknowledge that it causes a problem.
Now, if we were to make a change in this situation, do you have any idea of the type of individuals you would like to comprise a new selection committee? Lydia, what are your thoughts?
I think we need to get away from the universities and focus more on those covering the games, either looking at some of the broadcasters, specifically looking at analysts, hosts, making a panel of the people that are attending these games, covering the games, know the stats, but yet are unbiased to a specific team or specific players.
Now, how do you know that they're unbiased? Is there a certain way to do that?
There may always be some sort of biases, sure, but I think getting them away from either their alma mater, schools, from, you know, places you know that, okay, they've attended there, they lived there, grew up there. So those sort of ties, I think, are what is hindering the selection committee right now. Like what you said with Michigan State, Kansas, all these teams that have athletic directors. Like Austin said, they're on the payroll of the school. So even just breaking away from that is going to be a step in the right direction.
Now, what about you, Michael? Who would you put on this new selection committee if we were to make a change?
Now, for this new selection committee, I think what the best possible way to do it is to have not necessarily current athletic directors or current presidents or things like that, but rather former athletic directors or former head coaches. Like I mentioned earlier with the College Football Playoff Committee, what they use is a combination between current athletic directors, former athletic directors, and former head football coaches. Some of those on the College Football Playoff Committee feature Frank Beamer, who was a longtime head coach at Virginia Tech, Steve Weiberg even, former USA Today sports reporter. And I feel as though if we take more of those retired professionals, those who have experience in the field and are no longer involved with the process itself, I feel as though that would be a much more unbiased committee.
Now, Austin, we were talking before the show. I know you've got a few ideas of people you would want on your selection committee.
Well, I think that Michael really hit the nail on the head. You want people who know the game, people that have the experience, but they don't necessarily have those ties. So a couple of ideas I came up with. Jay Billis, he's a reporter. He does a really good job, I think, of being fairly unbiased when he's reporting on these teams. So why not let him have some kind of say in the tournament? Jim Calhoun, former UConn coach. He was pretty successful, knows what he's talking about. Bo Ryan, former Wisconsin coach. Ken Pomeroy, because I think that Ken Pom does a really good job with his rankings. And another one I think is it'd have to be Dickie V, because he's been around basketball forever. He knows his stuff. So why not let him have a say too?
And certainly an interesting perspective that all of them have, which would be somewhat different than the perspective provided by an athletic director, being that they're involved with these universities. Now, looking in the situation, if there wasn't a change to be made, do you think some people could possibly argue that having an athletic director in the selection process can be a fair practice, that it can be somewhat justified? Lydia, what do you think?
I think that some are certainly going to argue it. I think they're going to say that, there's athletic directors from all these schools. We all have to think unbiased. We want the best for everyone, and you don't want to let your own team in on an unfair advantage necessarily, because they could get crushed and humiliated. But at the same time, there are such close teams, and there's that whole bubble of teams that even if a team may be on that bubble, maybe on the outside of the bubble, if they have a voice that is going to stand up for them and get them in, they could get in and do fairly well. So I think although people will argue the other side and say, we are being unbiased, we're looking at the stats, there's always going to be those teams that are like, okay, you had an athletic director on the committee, this team didn't, and you guys got it. There's going to be those skeptics for sure.
What about you, Austin? Do you agree with that perspective?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a pretty easy argument to make that, it might not be fair, because you got to remember that, these schools are in these guys' pockets. That's a big priority for some people. And not necessarily that it's a purposeful bias, but it's human nature to be biased towards certain things.
Now, looking at another potential solution, because there's a multitude of options of ways you can possibly make a change, do you think there's a way to possibly go the route of the BCS, similar to how college football used to use a system of combined polling and polling coaches, media, bringing those together to create a tournament process? What do you think about that, Michael?
I think that there could definitely be a path for that to happen, but as we saw with the history of the BCS, everybody complained about the fact that the computers didn't get things right here or there, or that you had ties in situations like that where you needed something more than just a computer saying Team A wins over Team B. So I think it's possible, especially with something like Kenneth Pomeroy's rankings, whose rankings are seen as superior to the RPI's current system. So I think it is possible, just a bit of buyer beware if the NCAA basketball committee decides to go down this route.
What about you, Austin? Do you believe that we could go the statistics route or a polling route?
I think that doing it all through people probably isn't the best idea, because obviously you're going to have human error in any situation because it's human nature. Also, I don't think that going completely through statistics and computers and all that is the best idea either, because even computers can make some errors, because there aren't things that computers can measure, like a team's grit or drive. So I think that the best idea would be to combine the two, just have a mixture of statistics and of human, just look at the eye test and see if that team looks like they're what the computer says they are.
Now, another issue that we've kind of noticed with the conversation about utilizing statistics in this situation are those that are more traditional, that have been through the history of college basketball and don't foresee its need. Do you think that that argument against statistics from those that are more traditional would be too strong to utilize it, or it's unnecessary?
I don't think it's too strong. I understand where they're coming from, and I definitely can see both sides of the argument. But I think looking at how college football has progressed now, I don't think that necessarily that side would be too strong to say it's not a possibility. Like Austin said, there's certainly faults to it. There's going to be holes, such as understanding the team's grit, understanding the difficulty of their schedule, understanding, players' athleticism, some things like that that you can't necessarily measure straight from stats. But at the same time, you're going to get also the things that they're looking at right now, such as your points per game, your shooting percentages, all those basic stats you're going to be able to have at hand immediately ranking these teams. So if it's a combination of both using those stats and some players, I think that's a fair compromise for those that would say they're not a fan of stats because of the tradition.
What about your perspective on it, Michael?
I think that the tradition route could be possibly flawed because, again, you have bias and things like that. I mean, you could look at the blue blood such as Duke, UCLA, Kentucky, North Carolina, and Indiana, and you could stack all those 5 teams up, and they might get higher seeds because of their past successes and things like that. But it's more so about the season itself, and so I think you can see a bit of an issue when using that tradition route rather than a statistical, unbiased route.
Now, another thing to consider when looking at how we've noticed selection committee flaws and some of their mistakes is they've increased as we've increased the size of the field. Now, Austin, do you think that part of the issue is the size of the field? Do you think maybe we should change the size of the field or not?
I think that the size of the field is perfect where it's at because, they say it's March Madness, and some of the reason for that is that the field is so large. If there's 68 teams in there, there's 68 teams that can win the tournament. Unless, of course, you take out the 16 seeds because they've never won. So 64 teams that can win the tournament. That's why we get teams like, Xavier, who's an 11 seed that comes through and they get deep into the tournament. We get those Cinderella stories because there's so many different teams in the field.
Michael, what about your thoughts? Do you think the size of the field is justified?
I think the field is definitely justified because with basketball in particular, you need multiple games to decide series and things like that. That's why you see it in the NBA with a best 4 out of 7 for each round to sort of clearly see who is the true champion. And I think you need those multiple victories, and I think 6 victories in a row seems to be sufficient enough to really see, okay, this team is the one that is the best in all of college basketball.
And lastly, Lydia, do you agree with those sentiments, or do you think there should be a change in the size of the field?
No, I would agree with both of those, I think. I think personally, some of the smaller schools already that have a difficult time getting into the tournament and are on the bubble, make it in every once in a while. I already feel for those teams because they're coming from not the Big 5 power conferences. And I think by making the field even smaller, you're knocking out even more of those teams that would never get to see the spotlight. So at least at this size, you have a few that manage their way in, but at the same time, it's not hectic as in too big.
Well, it's certainly an interesting conversation, and it's worth having so much riding on March Madness and these decision-making processes. And I don't know if there will be a change. Maybe there will, maybe there won't. But that does it for today's show this week. Be sure to continue the discussion on our Twitter page at IUSTV Sports and on Facebook at IUSTV Sports. You can always give any suggestions for the show and ask any questions you might have. Toss it up. Find out if we'll catch it. Until next Sunday, be proud and cheer loud.